Good afternoon. I'd first like to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak at this really very interesting meeting. I've been working on a project called Kinetics for Drug Discovery that was a joint initiative of the European pharmaceutical industry and academia, supported by the European Union, with the aim, as written here, of enabling the adoption of drug target binding kinetic analysis in the drug discovery decision-making process. And this was a collaboration between experimental and computational scientists. One of the goals was to come up with procedures for systematically measuring binding kinetics, and we focused on targets, and kinase targets, and GPCRs, and a few others as examples of drug targets. The data generated during the project has been put into a database and will, as things get published, go into Campbell and be made available to everyone. Another aim was to understand the determinants of drug binding kinetics both in vivo and in vitro, and in particular to be able to come up with models, SKRs, structure kinetics, relationships, and computational tools. So this is sort of so more pictorially here. We have a really wide range of experimental techniques, a wide range of computational techniques were considered, and we tried really to come up with SKRs. And I think from the industry perspective, people were really hoping that one could come up with some simple rules to allow one to design compounds with the desired kinetic properties, in particular binding kinetic properties. Of course, binding kinetics is actually quite complicated, and so I think we've learned a lot about the determinants of kinetics. We've learned a lot about the ways to measure kinetics and to try and compute them, but there's much also to be done. And so what I want to show you today is basically three short topics. Two about what we've learned about determinants of drug binding kinetics from this combined experimental and computational work. One that, let's say, gives us a sort of easy message, and one that gives us a more complicated one. And then I want to talk about a method that we've developed called TRAMD for random acceleration molecular dynamics for computing drug protein residence times. So let's go into the first example I want to talk about. This was focused on a kinase, Haspin kinase, and was a protein that had been worked on in Stefan Knapp's laboratory in Frankfurt, where they solved structures with inhibitor complexes and did thermodynamic and kinetic measurements. And the interesting thing here is if we look at the inhibitor here compared to adenosine, it just has an additional halogen atom here. You can see the superposition of the two compounds in the binding site. And what's introduced here is a halogen interaction with a gatekeeper, an aromatic gatekeeper, a phenylalanine. And in this study, we looked at a number of different compounds varying in the halogen substituent in this position, and varying also in the residue at this gatekeeper position. And what this showed is that this halogen pi bonding type of interaction was important for giving tight binding and also for giving us a slow off rate. And as we increased the size of the halogen, we got slower dissociation. Rotating away the aromatic immediately led to fast binding kinetics. We wanted to understand this computationally, so we did some quantum mechanical calculations of the interaction between the ligand and the aromatic residue, and you can see here plotted against the experimental off rates the interaction energy computed, which shows a good agreement apart from an outlier for this threonine mutant without the aromatic interaction. And we can see that this is largely due to the correlation energy interaction. Of course, with the quantum mechanical model, we could only just look at a small bit of the binding site, and so we also did MMGBSA calculations to compute the binding free energy, considering the whole protein. And here it was very important that we used the halogen extra point model to capture the sigma hole effect, and therefore could get a reasonable correlation here with binding free energy, or with the components of the terms computed with the binding enthalpy. And so this study gave us in principle a fairly simple rule. If you want to increase residence time, think about adding in halogen pi interactions. It also showed us from the from the computational perspective the issues that we can have, of course, with dealing with trying to deal with these sorts of interactions with classical force fields. Now let's go to a system where we have a bit more complicated determinants of the binding kinetics, in this case related to the protein conformational dynamics. So I'm going to talk here about heat shock protein 90, the N-terminal domain. Those of you who were here 2 days ago already had an introduction to this system. This particular domain has been the target of much design of anti-cancer compounds, and so we have a huge amount of information about various types of inhibitors that bind in this HSP binding site. But what's interesting for our purposes today is that this binding site has on one side an alpha helix, but it's not always an alpha helix. And if you look at different crystal structures, you can see this region sometimes is so-called loop out, sometimes loop in, and sometimes helical. And when we have this change in the backbone structure, we also get a change in the shape of the binding pocket, and also then, of course, the ligands that combine. So we have here an introduction of a sort of sub-pocket or transient pocket. So we looked at a set of 20 resorcinal class compounds, and this was work that was done together with scientists at Merck, Darmstadt, and at Sanofi. And what we found here for this set of 20 compounds, varying basically in two sites here, was that some of them, a subset, bound to the protein and showed a loop-in conformation here, and others bound to the helical conformation, in particular occupying this sub-pocket. If you look at the thermodynamics, you can see that the ones binding to this helical conformation, the so-called helix binders, are entropically driven. So this is interesting because this is high affinity, sub-nanomolar binding that is entropically driven. The loop binders, on the other hand, are enthalpically driven. When we come to the kinetics, you can see that the compounds binding to the helical conformation had lower on rates, and slower off. So they have slow kinetics compared to the ones binding to the loop conformation. So, can we try and understand this difference here? Well, for that, we'd like to be able to simulate the dynamics of this system. And what we first did was just to run standard molecular dynamic simulations. And if you say start with the helical conformation here, it'll pretty much happily stay in that helical conformation. If you start in a loop conformation, it'll stay in a loop conformation. So in standard simulations, we've done, this is 500 nanoseconds, we've done more than microseconds, nothing much happens. So now comes a bit related to Markov state models. So we thought, well, what else can we do? We can try and do some enhanced sampling. So Mark Pianchotti is somewhere in the audience, tried to do metadynamics for this. It proved very difficult to find a set of collective variables that allowed us to sample this transition. So we also tried to do some adaptive sampling, so running many 100 nanosecond simulations and then restarting from positions that would allow us perhaps to sample the transition between these different conformations. But so far we haven't been able to sample adequately in order to be able to begin even really properly to build a Markov state model. So the problem is really that we have a very slow transition between these different states. On the other hand, we applied our LRIP, Langevin rotationally induced perturbation approach, to sample this dynamic. So this is a method based on the rotationally induced perturbation method developed by Dave Eggard that we adapted in order to try and find transient pockets in proteins. And the idea is that you go around the residues around a binding site, and for each residue you put the kinetic energy into one side chain dihedral angle, and then you let the system sort of go in a very short implicit solvent simulation and then relax further with explicit solvent. And in this way you can sample the dynamics around the binding site. And what you'll notice I'm just showing the sampling now for two different residues, that you can see we're perturbing this helical region here and sampling these different loop conformations that you see in the different crystal structures. And this is all done in a few nanoseconds of simulation. So it allows us really very quickly to probe the distortions of a binding site. And as I said, we've aimed at doing this to identify changes in pocket conformation that are relevant for ligand binding. Now, based on this and looking at the residues that had the biggest effect on the helix structure, we noticed that the primary one was this leucine 107. And so we thought, well, what happens if we mutate this residue to an alanine? We would expect that perhaps to stabilize the helix. And in simulations that we did, starting from the helix conformation or starting from the loop conformation, you can see that in the mutant, the helical form is stabilized with respect to the wild type. What happens experimentally? Well, Marta Amaral at Merck solved the crystal structure of the mutant, and you can see the mutant structure overlapped from the wild type. It looks exactly the same. So that didn't really tell us much. Then we have some data from FTIR from Jörn Gudenholt in Bochum, and he actually saw in his studies in solution that there's more helical structure in the mutant. And we're in the process now of also doing NMR studies on this system, which show us actually that the protein in the APO form is rather flexible, and that this is not the main conformation that you have of the protein. So if the mutant is more stable than the wild type, what effect does that have on binding to compounds? That will change the relative stability of our complexes. And we could see that again by running simulations with compounds where we have the sort of loop type model, or the conformation, or the helical conformation. And you can see in general that the mutation would stabilize the helical form. And what's going on if it does that? Because when we take the leucine side chain away, we are taking some of the interactions with the ligand away. But what the protein actually does, as you can see from the crystal structure here with the mutant, is to slightly adjust the position of the helix so that the adjacent asparagine can make the interactions with the ligand, and we can maintain this sort of sub-pocket that we have underneath the helix. So now let's go back to the thermodynamics and kinetics. Here we have the wild type I showed you before. Here's the mutant. We can see that on mutation, the entropically favored binding to the helical conformation becomes less entropically favored. Right? We shift more in this direction towards enthalpic binding. Moreover, the on rates, as you can see here, have shifted such that the on rates on average are indistinguishable between the two conformations here, although the difference in the off rates is maintained. So this has now become, let's say, probably, I would say the mutant will become more of a conventional protein target. Can we understand that better? Well, we can see if we look at B factors in the crystal structures of the protein, that if you can compare the looped conformation with the helical one, red indicates higher mobility. We've got more mobility in the helical form, hinting that the helix dynamics is important for this entropically driven binding. Computationally, what we tried to do is to compute basically all the entropy terms that we could do, and that's what I'm trying to show over here. So we're looking now to compare wild type and mutant, and the differences between the helix binders and the loop binders. The experimental data is here. And here's our overall computed entropic contribution, and we've computed different contributions. Initially we thought, well, maybe solvent is important, but if you compute ligand desolvation or protein desolvation, you cannot distinguish between these two, the mutant and the wild type, also for the binding entropy. And the only place we see the difference is in the entropy considering the two helices and this loop helix transition. And we estimated that by two techniques. One was using a quasi-harmonic PCA type of approach to give us a sort of upper estimate on the entropy contribution. And the other one was using this correlation-corrected multibody local approximation for torsions, which would give us a lower estimate. So we're sort of between these two values, and you can see that's a huge range in entropy, but at least it is consistent with the experimental data, gives us some sort of ballpark estimate of the entropic contribution, and indicates how the helix dynamics may have an effect upon the binding. So schematically what we can see here is for this set of compounds that we looked at here, the helix binders have their long residence times due to stabilizing the ground state and affecting the transition state, whereas binding to the mutant, more the effect between the different compounds is affecting the differences in binding to the ground state. I should note that in this case, the long residence times are important also at the cellular level. The sustained inhibitory effect leads to an intracellular upregulation of HSP90 monitored. And so we see here that the conformational flexibility of the protein in the bound state can contribute to the entropically driven high binding affinity and long residence times, suggesting actually that it would be advantageous to think about targeting protein targets where you've got that bit of flexibility that you can maintain in the bound state. So that was what we sort of learned from trying to understand the structure-kinetic relationships for this particular class of compounds binding to HSP90. Now, if you think about schematically, very simply, about the process of a ligand binding to a protein and trying to look at the kinetics, from a computational perspective, what I've shown you so far has just been studying this bound state. But really, we need to consider this transition state as well in computations. And obviously, that's difficult because our force fields are generally trained on the bound states and not what's up here. And of course, there can be ligand parameter issues like I showed before for halogens. And moreover, sampling is probably going to be trickier here than here for greater flexibility, considering greater flexibility. So going back to this beginning of this project, I mentioned the K4DD project. We wrote a review at the beginning, which we thought we'd write about drug binding kinetics, and really there was hardly anything in the literature about computations of drug binding kinetics. There was lots on kinetics, but not on drug-like molecules. And more recently, we've written another review down here, and of course in this time there's just been a huge flurry of activity with lots of people producing all sorts of different techniques to compute drug binding kinetics. And we tried to put them together in this paper. So we've got a range of techniques for calculating dissociation rates, another range for association rates, and for pathway sampling. And these range from techniques that just need a few nanoseconds of simulation right up to very computationally expensive procedures. Many of these have been developed also by people in the audience here, and most often they're tested on one or a few cases, sometimes sort of, as it were, simple cases like benzamide and trypsin binding. But what has been lacking, of course, is access to large data sets to really develop and test the methods. And this is what we've tried to address as a need in this K4DD project. We have been developing a few techniques, and I'm only going to tell you today about one of them, but just to mention, we're working on combining Brownian and molecular dynamics to compute on rates. We're working on sort of more machine learning or QSKR approaches to estimate relative on rates and off rates based on some work we did years ago to develop combined analysis or comparative binding energy analysis for binding affinities. We find this works actually remarkably well for off rates. And also we'll be working on this method that I'm going to discuss today, TRAMD, which is an enhanced sampling procedure where we try to accelerate the rate of ligand unbinding in order to give us relative residence times. So it's similar a bit in spirit to some of the scaled molecular dynamics you probably heard about this meeting, or targeted or steered molecular dynamics, but the procedure is different. And the aim is to have a really computationally rather quick, cheap method that you can apply quite easily, perhaps doing something like lead optimization. So I want to tell you about that for the remainder of my time. So it's based on the random acceleration or random expulsion molecular dynamics method that we developed really quite some years ago, with the aim of trying to understand how small molecules can get out of buried binding sites in proteins. The technique is extremely simple. We do a standard molecular dynamics simulation with the one addition that we add a force to the center of mass of our ligand in a random orientation. And then we run the simulation for a certain number of steps, and then we look and see whether the ligand moved or didn't. If it moved, we just keep going, and if it didn't, we choose randomly a new orientation for our force and keep going. And this allows us to get the ligand out of the binding site in timescales of about a nanosecond, and to do that in a way that we just sort of gently, as it were, probe to find our way out of the binding site with sort of minimum perturbation of everything else, so that we can really just focus on accelerating the ligand exit. So now this gives you this example of 3 trajectories that we have simulated for a ligand going out of HSP90. So you get some idea of the motions. You can see we've got one going out here. You'll see these take a bit longer to go out. And the idea is that the length of time that we need to get the ligand out during the TRAMD simulations should be related to the actual real residence time, even though we've accelerated the time scale a lot. And so if we can correctly predict relative residence times, then we're going to be able to extract information also about the key features of the transition barrier to egress and of the unbinding, and be able to understand the unbinding process and therefore the determinants of residence time. So you'll see here, this one goes out here, and this one, after having to twist around for some time, ends up going out over here. So you can see that the method is unbiased. You don't say where it's going to go out before it goes out. Now, in order to use TRAMD for computing residence times, we've come up with this protocol which we call tau for residence time, tau-RAMD, which is a procedure that allows you to set up the parameters, equilibrate the system, importantly sample well over the bound states, and then taking snapshots from your equilibration MD molecular dynamics and go into the random acceleration molecular dynamics, do multiple trajectories of these, ensure you've done enough sampling if necessary to go back with certain criteria for that. And then after you've, from the simulations, you basically look at when the ligand goes out and can compute from a set of trajectories an effective residence time, and you can analyze the statistics to make sure you have sampled sufficiently well in order to get a reasonably reliable quantity. This whole procedure is set up now as a fully sort of full workflow. And there's basically only one adjustable parameter, which is the force magnitude, which is constant throughout the simulations for our additional random force. We found that this value works well for a wide range of drug target systems, but sometimes you need to adjust it a little bit. We've tested the adjustment. The procedure is fairly robust to that, but it really depends, of course, whether you're looking at very fast or very slow binding kinetics. Overall, we need about 80 to 200 nanoseconds per compound for this, and as I said, no priori knowledge of dissociation pathway. So we've been working on a number of different systems. It's just to show, I will talk about the HSP90 application, but we're also working on different kinases, type 1 and type 2 inhibitors, and GPCRs. And you can see we get correlation, as illustrated here, between computation and experimental residence times. So I'll just show you about the HSP90 case. Here we were lucky enough to have a large data set with 70 complexes consisting of helix binders and loop binders. They are very diverse inhibitors. They occupy both the ATP binding site and this hydrophobic pocket under the helix and another solvent pocket, and have a quite wide range of kinetic parameters. This just to show they have 11 different scaffolds with different interactions with solvent in the binding site as well. So this is the result we get for this data set. Here's the computed residence time versus the experimental one. You'll see that most of the compounds lie on this line here with about a factor of twofold in the range for agreement between experiment and computed values. This is not dependent on whether we have crystal structures or not. The reliability here is dependent on how many trajectories you do. So as you increase the number of trajectories, you reduce the standard deviation in your computed residence time. In some systems, you are dependent. You have dependence, or others less dependence on the initial snapshot that you start the RAMD trajectories from. That depends very much on the system. We have looked at why do we have these outliers. You can see one lot is all in green, so this is one particular class. Within that class is actually quite a good ranking, but clearly they're on a different line from the others. We think this is a force field issue, but we're not sure why. Some of them are related to stabilization of the initial bound state. So if I take that particular outlier, that's this compound here, and one can see just after the equilibration stage, after 20 nanoseconds of equilibration compared to the crystal structure conformation, there's some change here, and this change is enough to destabilize the system such that in the RAMD calculations we have an underestimate of the residence time. So again, we think this is something where we maybe should experiment with different force fields, but it's not directly related to the RAMD procedure. Here's another example where you can get a range of residence times computed. Here we've showed two structures at the end of independent molecular dynamic simulations, equilibration simulations, before we start the RAMD calculations. And you can see they just differ in a side chain, this phenylalanine. That's how it is in the crystal structure. In this case, it's sort of come inwards, come outwards, becomes solvent exposed, and the ligand has gone into where that phenylalanine ring was. And when the ligand then needs to go out of the binding site, the phenylalanine gets in the way and is a hindrance and leads to much longer computed times. So we have, in this case, for different trajectories starting from this or this structure, shorter or longer residence times. So this is a general sort of sampling issue we have to deal with looking at kinetics. I should just point out that within congeneric theories, we can compute the trends correctly, and that's in both in cases where you do and do not have a relationship between the off rate and the binding affinity. And we can also get some mechanistic information here. I'm just showing this, for example, for 3 different structures where we have different range of residence times, also different on and off rates. And we can see that for the slowest unbinding compound, we have more variation in the protein structure upon unbinding, and that's because, as shown in this diagram here, we have more than one route out. This is the compound I showed you the movies of before. Whereas for the other compounds that go off more quickly, we just have exit via this route here. So we can get different mechanisms of exit, and this is related here to the need or not for the ligand to distort, and in this case we picked up charge interactions that were important for the residence time. So just to sum up, I want to just say that I think the RAMD procedure allows one to have with a very computationally efficient procedure to explore the egress pathways and to compute relative resonance times. Of course, these are also relevant for understanding actually binding free energies, because we're sampling both the ground state and the transition state to unbinding, and we can get some information about dissociation mechanisms. Finally, I just want to draw your attention to this website we set up called KBbox as a sort of toolbox for computational methods for studying kinetics of molecular binding. So this is designed as a sort of place, particularly where new users can go and find out about different sorts of approaches and when they might be able to use them according to what data they have available or what they want to find out. And gradually, as we publish the work from my lab, but also from other laboratories out of K4DD, we will put tutorials and worked examples on this website, and I would also encourage you to contribute to this website with your different methodologies that you have computing kinetics. It's just a sort of site where you can find out about these things. You can't actually do you cannot do the computations there at this point. Okay, and finally, I'd just like to thank all my collaborators, in particular Daria Koch, a senior postdoc in the group, who has done the work on HSP90 calculations and on the TRAMD method, and Gaurav Ganotra, a doctoral student who did the work on the Haspin kinase, and all of these other people for their various contributions to the work. Thank you for your attention.
We have time for one question.
So yeah, I think this is really, really phenomenal work, and it's really comprehensive. So the question we're really interested in is looking at kind of the robustness of the ligand binding transition state. Once we start looking at different ligands, how many or what types of features are conserved in the ligand binding transition state. So you showed some different pathways, and you would expect that those would be, let's say, different in terms of the molecular features. But in general, looking over the set of 70 ligands, can you speak to which, if any, of the features of the transition state are conserved?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we've been trying to analyze the trajectories and dig out information and also do simple regression analyses and see if we can come up with simple determinants. And we cannot say there's just one factor that's important. So even if you have the same route out, you have different factors determining the transition and so on. So we've looked at, what sort of contacts are more contacts that you don't have, for example, in the bound state, but you do have in the transition state before you go out. These, you do pick up features there, but you cannot say that they're always present, right? So I think you've really got a number of different features contributing, and this is something we are now playing with machine learning techniques to try and see if we can dig out. Because, I mean, if you just have simple things like halogen-pi interactions, of course, you can focus in on that. And we have a few simple factors, certain ligands where you really have to change a certain dihedral angle, for example. But in many cases, there are alternatives, right? There are alternative interactions that a ligand can make in going out of one route, for example. And those together contribute to the transition barrier for the ligand axis.